It's interesting. It's important that we understand absolutely thoroughly about the Thatcher period. It was interesting listening to Davey. I used to work for the NUM in that period, and I was also Deputy Leader of the Greater London Council. And I understand the Thatcher context in this way. By the way, have you seen The Guardian today? Yeah. Hilary Mantel's article. Hilary Mantel has done an article, and she's written a short story on the assassination of Thatcher. I got into trouble once when I was on Any Questions, and they asked the question, Ashes to Ashes, that programme that was on TV. It was about people going back in time and performing an act of goodness or whatever. So they asked the question, if you could go back in time, what act would you do to change? And I said I'd go back and most probably, I wanted to say section Thatcher, but I said assassinate Thatcher. And I'm not joking, this was in Wales, the Any Questions was, and the audience got up, they were literally at their biggest applause I've had in my life. They had to quieten them down before they could broadcast again. I was asked the same question at a GMB conference, and it was reported there, it was during the leadership campaign. And then I got back to London, and literally by the next morning I was all over the front page of the Daily Mail and all the rest of it, condemned by every other candidate that was standing at the time. And I was on a phone-in, and some colonel from Surrey phoned up, and I thought he was having a coronary. I said, oh, I'm really sorry if I've upset you in that way. But I thought there was massive support for actually assassinating Margaret Thatcher. So what's interesting, Hilary Mantel is most probably about to make a fortune out of this book. I'm going to sue her on copyright grounds. Thatcher understood what she was doing. She understood it better, I think, than some of us at the time. There's three ways in which working people change the world, we've discovered. One is we come together in our workplaces, in trade unions, and through solidarity we have collective strength. The second is that we discovered that we could also come together politically in solidarity and seek electoral victory and therefore elect a government. So that's how we formed a political party, the Labour Party. We'll come back to that in a minute. And the third is we used to call it insurrection, but we're now politely call it direct action. They're the three ways in which we seek to change the world. What Thatcher understood is that she was capable in that 80s period of neutralising each one of those routes for change. In terms of democracy, what she did, she couldn't abolish elections. She would if she could, but she couldn't. So what she did is she tried to abolish elections as best she could. So she scrapped. I was on the GLC. I was the chair of finance. We used to spend money to redistribute wealth from the City of London, around London, invest in community resources, building it up, tackling unemployment, etc. And on County Hall, which is opposite Parliament, we used to put up the numbers of unemployed London. And she would sit there having her tea and watch this change month by month and go up. And I think it tipped her over the edge, to be honest. And at that point in time, I think she was clinically insane. But what she realised, that she might not be able to abolish national elections, but she could local elections. So she scrapped the GLC, the Mets, and all those with a democratic mandate to oppose Thatcherism. That was the first route. The second was, in terms of insurrection, as has just been said, she introduced some of the most draconian attacks on civil liberties. And time and time again, if you go back to the 80s, you'll see large numbers of people being arrested, serving sentences, etc., for any form of political demonstration. It was quite remarkable. The anti-civil liberties and anti-human rights legislation that she brought in. And she also, if you remember that time, most of you are not old enough, she also ensured that the state were resourced to do that. The police had huge pay rises during that period, and they were given free rein on the streets. And they had free rein. Some of us were arrested during that period on the slightest charges. I was arrested twice. I was fitted up by the Metropolitan Police Special Patrol Group. In Parliament Square, the Greenham Common women were arrested for singing in Parliament Square. They did a list of all the names who were arrested. They passed it to me because the legal observers had been arrested at the same time. I was arrested and I was charged with grievous bodily harm. I was supposed to have jumped over a barrier, attacked two police officers and jumped on the back of another. Thank God, in those days we didn't have DVDs and all that, so it was a cine camera. Thank God there was an American tourist there with a cine camera who filmed a lot, and I was seen simply receiving a pen and paper. And I got, oh, Paul Boateng represented, whatever happened to him? Paul Boateng represented. But that was happening. Large numbers of people were being swept off the streets, and the police were able to do it. The third area was obviously she understood that the other area in which people can change the world is through trade union rights, solidarity, people coming together. So it was inevitable that she was going to provoke some trade union dispute that would seek to break the trade union movement. And she chose the miners because they were the vanguard of the trade union movement at the time. I was appointed to the NUM, I was a humble bloody bureaucrat working in the pensions and all the rest of it. I was appointed by Nick McCarthy, Lawrence Daly and Gormley, 3 unbelievable trade unionists who came up from the pits, from the shop floor, all of them, and fought their way through dispute after dispute. Hardened trade unionists who knew how to win victories. So it was inevitable that she targeted the miners to break them. And that's what she sought to do. And then once she'd done that, that gave her the opportunity to bring in the anti-trade union laws. And that was the reality of it. And since then, exactly as Ian, David, and has been said, since then, what's happened is that we've, even in the economic boom under the Blair years, the amount of resources, the productive resources produced within our economy, the greater proportion has increasingly gone to capital as against labour. Because that's what the anti-trade union laws were all about. It was to discipline the trade union movement so we couldn't represent our members, it would undermine collective bargaining, and as a result of that, the wealth of the economy would flow to the top, to capital, not labour. And that's happened right the way throughout the last 20, 30 years. And it's resulted, it's interesting, isn't it? It's resulted not just in poverty, but in economic terms, the economists are among you. It produced the last economic crisis. Why was that? Because what happens, if you can't earn a living, what do? If you can't pay your mortgage, pay your wages, put food on the end of it, no matter how good the economy is, if you're not earning enough, what do? You borrow. And then eventually the bubble, the debt builds up, and the credit crunch occurs. That's basic economics, because what's happening is aggregate demand is being reduced. It can't keep up, so people borrow. And that's what's happening now. That's what's happening now. If you listen to the economic results every month, you listen first of all to what's happening in terms of economic growth, you then listen to what's happening in terms of wages, you then listen to what's in terms of inflation, and then unemployment. And the key factors is wages increasing below the rate of inflation. So effectively, wage cut after wage cut after wage cut every month. So how are people surviving? Well, they're surviving at the moment, exactly as has been said, as Ian said, and others. What's happened is people are going up the food banks, but in addition to that, they're borrowing again. So we're now going through the same economic reasons the economic crisis caused in 2008, we're now building up the same factors to create us into the next economic crisis. And when you hear this issue about growth going on, of course there's some growth, because when the economy hits the bottom, eventually it begins to bounce back slowly. But what Osborne has done is like any other government in the past, he's thrown money at it in terms of housing investment. But even that now is creating a debt bubble because people can't afford actually to pay the mortgage for that. So it's almost a classic building up of an economic nightmare yet again for the next generation. Now what I can't understand is if we all understand that, who the fuck can't Ed Balls? Seriously, pardon my language, I'm really frustrated with it. Well, that's it. We're just going round the same circle. Because this week, unless we break in these coming months Labour's commitment to austerity light, we're going to go through the same economic crisis and the same people will suffer. And it'll be working class people. Because at the moment, the oligarchs and the corporations are walking away laughing all the way to the bank, and they'll protect themselves against the next credit crunch. So the key factor in all of this debate in this coming week, the Labour Party conference and beyond, is this issue about trade union rights. Because if we can't restore the strength of collective bargaining, it undermines any hope that we've got of transforming our economy. And I think most people who have come to Manchester this week, the Labour Party conference delegates and others who are coming, I just think people are coming to almost plead with the Labour leadership, give us something to vote for. Just give us something to vote for. Give us some hope that the party that we established may just be listening to us and may just seek to implement some of the policies that aren't just advocated because we're diehard socialists and all the rest, we are, but actually are practical economics as well. And that's why we've put forward a trade union agenda. I'll run you through. Ian mentioned the key one, the minimum wage. If we can't establish a living wage, to be honest, most of the next generation is sunk anyway. And the £10 an hour, people say, well, it's extravagant. No, it isn't. It's a basic minimum as far as we're concerned. And the issue around 0 hours contracts is 0 hours contracts are used to enforce a minimum wage and sometimes below a minimum wage. Particularly, we're wearing our fast food campaign badges. If you look at the fast food sector, the hospitality sector, whatever you call it at the moment, if you look at it, the exploitation that goes on there means that people, many of them, most of them, are living below the living wage anyway. The other issue, though, is actually it's no use establishing a minimum wage if you're not establishing a maximum wage, because inequality will develop. That's what Wilkinson said. Cameron has argued, interestingly enough, in the public sector, in the civil service and elsewhere, there should be a higher pay ratio. But no civil servant or chief executive should get 20 times more than the average wage within that department. Well, if it's good enough for the public sector, why not the private sector? Why can't we establish a maximum pay ratio? No executive. At the moment, if you're a director in the top 100 FTSE companies, you will earn 160 times the average wage in your company. Why can't we introduce a maximum pay ratio of 20 times? That would force them, if they want a pay raise, to raise actually those at the lowest level as well. I'll quickly go through these. The outlawing of 0 hour contracts is obviously, I think, become inevitable. In terms of restoring rights at work, it isn't just about balloting and all the rest. That's what we've focused on. But it is about restoring the right to secondary action, restoring the right to solidarity. If this person is being treated unjustly in the firm next to me, why shouldn't I have the ability to support that worker as well? It offends me as much as it does them. And why? Because if they get away with the practices there, they'll introduce them in my company as well. So secondary action is critical. Free access to justice at work. At the moment, a lot of people, there's been a decline in people going to tribunals. Why? Because they can't afford the 1,500 quid that's demanded of them. Making blacklisting a criminal offence. I've had enough of let's have another inquiry. They're criminals, these directors. They should go down and they should never be allowed to. Throughout the 80s, we were talking about democracy at work. That seems to have disappeared off the agenda at the moment. If you work for a company, it's you who produces the wealth. So why shouldn't you have a say about how that wealth is invested? Right the way across Europe now, there are legal rights to have workers represented on company boards. Why can't we? We should be demanding that. In that way, we'd be able to ensure a company invested properly and our wages and our working conditions were protected. But also, let me just say this, even the Tories are now going on that the mutualisation, PCS and others are being threatened with mutualisation of public services. What they mean is privatisation. But mutualisation and John Lewis model that they keep on advocating, this cooperative model, is this wonderful thing. Well, why can't we actually do it elsewhere? Why not in the private sector? If a group of workers come together and vote in a majority to cooperatise their company, why not? Because in that way, they'll not only protect themselves, they'll protect the long-term interests of the company and the consumers as well. Finally, let me just say this. Thatcher also knew that one of the things that she could make profits out of, but at the same time force down wages and subjugate trade unions, was through the policy of privatisation. Now, I'm pleased that the Labour Party has said now that they'll scrap the legislation that they introduced to privatise the NHS. That's fantastic. But what I want now is a commitment to bring it all back. All those things that have been sold off so far. We talk about rail and Royal Mail, etc. They're the easy ones. I want energy back. I want water back. I want all those basic utilities that people desperately need to survive in life. Because not only have they been used to rip us off, they've been used to force down wages and introduce working conditions which I think are appalling. Finally, let me just say this. I also think we need to have a trade union agenda about making people safe at work. 140 deaths a year at work is not good enough, and many more on top of that. But the recent health and safety legislation is undermining health and safety across the piece for self-employed workers, and more workers now are being forced into self-employment as a result. We need a commitment to restore that back. What this government has done is introduced a new form of feudalism. If you remember your history, the old form of feudalism was the barons and king at the top, the serfs in the middle, the slaves at the bottom. What they've introduced a new form of feudalism, where the corporations and the oligarchs are at the top. The workers have become serfs, and we've introduced a new form of slavery. It's called workfare. So anyone who works for nothing is a slave as far as I'm concerned. So we want a Labour government that ends workfare once and for all. I think that's a modest, fairly moderate, hardly revolutionary agenda. It's one that any other Labour government before Blair would have naturally introduced. I think this is almost a John Smith type agenda. You know, rights at day one, John Smith was introducing. I think it's the least we should be demanding of the Labour Party this week. But if it doesn't happen, well then we have to fall back on those two other mechanisms that we have. One is industrial action, and the other is direct action. And I think in these coming weeks, in October in particular, we want to make sure that everyone else we can and our demonstrations we're planning are out on the streets. I also think that when industrial action takes place, we have an automatic duty to support it. Because I don't want just to have a Labour government elected in May. I want to try and use industrial action and direct action to bring this government down as soon as we possibly can. Solidarity.